Thank you very much, Hans, and hi everybody who's joining us today for this webinar. I'm Jeremy Sung from the Energy Efficiency Division of the IEA, and I'm an analyst in that team who has led the work on the Energy Efficiency 2019 report. And I'm also joined by Tim Goodson here, who is an analyst from the World Energy Outlook team. Do you want to say hi, Tim?
Hi everyone, thanks for joining today. So I'll be giving a few insights relating to some trends behind the meter that have been published in the recent World Energy Outlook.
And we were going to have Hamy Bahar from the Renewables team join us as well. Unfortunately, he was called away at the last minute, so I'm afraid you'll have to hear from me on the Renewables content. And if you have any questions that we can't answer on that, we'll hope to provide some answers later. But thanks for joining us again, and we'll get started now. The way that we're going to, I'm just making sure that this is, there we go. So I'm going to start with Energy Efficiency 2019 and some results from that, which basically are summarizing what's happening in terms of demand and efficiency globally. And what we've seen here is that in 2018, demand was the highest it's been for some time. The last decade, you can see it was never as high, the growth rate in demand was never as high as it was in 2018, where it was around 2.3%. That was primarily in the largest economies, the US and China, which were responsible for about 60% of that growth. Now, of course, this is primary demand, and so the good news is the renewables and gas is also growing fast as a share of the primary demand. So we are seeing a shift to cleaner energy sources, but as you'll see, that wasn't the only story. So primary energy intensity, which is primary demand divided by GDP, this is our primary indicator of energy efficiency improvement. And what we saw in 2018 is that the rate of primary energy intensity was the slowest rate of improvement that we've seen in the last few years. So if you look at 2015, the rate of improvement was about 3%, meaning that 3% less energy per unit of GDP was being consumed by the global economy compared to the year before. As we've seen from that year onwards, though, the rate has been declining, and in 2018 it was around only 1.2% less energy for every unit of GDP. Now, what we know from our analysis is that the rate of improvement should be around 3%, given the cost-effective energy efficiency opportunities that are out there. And unfortunately, we're moving away from that rate. So this year, we wanted to explore why that's the case and how, what factors are behind that slowdown in the rate of improvement. And we identified broadly three groups of factors. First of all, there were short-term factors, such as recent jumps in industrial activity and exceptional weather. Then we identified that there were some broader trends, and we really zoom in on these in the slide deck later on, so I'll get into what those are, but we call those structural trends, essentially. And then the third factor that we looked at is policy progress and investment, the sort of things that governments can do to try and offset this rising demand. And unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot of progress there either. So let's look at the short-term factors first of all. Well, one of the factors was energy-intensive sectors have been growing. And when they grow, energy demand tends to grow. So here's an example. China's steel sector grew for the last couple of years quite significantly. And in 2018, it grew by 8% and 6% in 2018 after four flattish years. And China's steel sector alone consumes 4% of global farm demand. So you can see that just that one sector can have a very large impact on global energy use. And another short-term factor here is weather. So in a lot of the parts of the world, we've seen very hot summers and hot summers and mild winters or cold winters in certain parts of the world as well. And that has implications for energy demand. And this example comes from the US, where we saw gas use influenced by these temperature changes. And essentially the anomalies in temperature in these months, September, October, November, for example, some of the cooler months, we saw gas demand up by around 40% in November, for example, due to this colder weather. And the same was true in other parts of the world where there were hotter summers leading to higher air conditioning use. So that's driving up electricity demand. And these are short-term factors, but of course, with climate change, we're seeing some trends emerge around weather and climate that could mean that what is an exceptional factor becomes more of the norm. So something for us to keep in mind for the future as well. Okay, so let's go to the second group of factors, and we talked about these being what we call structural factors. So this is a slide that shows you the net energy saving, the energy savings from technical energy efficiency improvements. And essentially, in every year in this chart, we see that technical energy efficiency improvements is saving quite a lot of energy globally. And this comes from our decomposition analysis. And you can see that in 2015, that was really the highest year of savings from technical efficiency improvements. And then there's been a bit of a decline every year since. But structural factors can do two things. They can either push up the energy gains, the energy savings gains, or they can cut into those gains. And if I click ahead, what we can see is that in 2012 and 2013, structural factors were actually helping us to save more energy. So you can see they basically doubled the energy savings that we were achieving from our technical efficiency. But in the last few years, we've seen the opposite effect. So structural factors have started to eat into the savings that technical efficiency brings. And in the last year, in 2018, you can see that the structural change almost halved the technical efficiency savings that the technical efficiency is bringing. So this is what we wanted to delve into in a little bit more detail this year and explain what some of those structural factors are. And here's an example. So this comes from the building sector, and this is from our decomposition analysis again. And we can see that in the building sector, and in fact, we're just focusing on residential buildings, that should be clear. The technical efficiency gains there had saved around 3 exajoules. However, offsetting that, you've got this combination of activity and structural effects. So things like population and weather, those factors have pushed up activity use. And then some of the structural impacts include things like a higher floor area per person and greater use of appliances, and people buying more appliances as well. Now, this is partly a result of improvements in the standard of living. So we've got certain countries that didn't ever own these sorts of appliances, owning them for the first time, and that's a good thing that should be encouraged. People getting a better standard of living and nicer places to live, having more access to energy services. However, because our technical efficiency and gains aren't improving fast enough to offset that, this is having net impacts on demand. And I should also add that some of the structural impacts are happening in developed economies that already have access to services, and they're asking essentially for even more. So there is questions to be raised here about what an appropriate policy response might be. This is another example from transport and our transport decomposition analysis. And you can see here that technical efficiency has had quite a big impact here. But at the same time, some of the structural impacts are still offsetting the gains that we've had. So, for example, intermodal shifts, that's the shift between modes, from one mode to another. So from shifting from, say, vehicles to rail and rail to air. Well, the shift, the net impact of those shifts is that energy demand is going up. So we're probably seeing a shift away from more efficient modes of transport like rail to less efficient like vehicles. Then there's the vehicle type, things like whether it's a passenger vehicle or a two-wheeler to a four-wheeler. Also the vehicle size, and that's under vehicle type as well. So this is things like a sedan moving to an SUV. And then occupancy, how many people are in each vehicle. So all of those factors, which are really come down to behaviour and people's decision-making, are affecting demand in a way that is starting to eat into the gains from things like better fuel economy. Okay, now the third group of changes I mentioned were around policy and investment. And on the left here, we have a chart showing mandatory policy. And essentially, that really hasn't changed as fast as we would like to have seen. So in 2018, around 1/3 of energy use is covered by mandatory policies, things like codes and standards in buildings, minimum energy performance standards for appliances and vehicle emission standards and fuel economy standards. And really that hasn't changed fast enough. So that a lot of the world's energy consumption is still not covered by those sort of policies. And the reason we talk about mandatory policies is because they're an easy one for us to track progress on, and we know that they deliver a minimum level of savings. So there is a bit of a focus on those policies. But also investment has remained very flat. Essentially, our analysis from the 2018 market report showed that between now and 2025, investments needed to double and then double again between 2026 and 2040. What we saw last year was an improvement rate of less than 1%, an investment rate increase of less than 1%. So it's nowhere near the doubling that we need to see if we're to hit our sustainable development and climate change mitigation goals. It's also a lost opportunity for the global economy. So basically this shows that from the improvements we did see, the 1.2% improvement in energy intensity, the world saved around $1.6 trillion or made, in a way, more GDP by $1.6 trillion compared to the year before. However, it would have been 2.5 times bigger had we hit that 3% rate. Now, it wasn't all bad news. Of course, efficiency that we did see continued to deliver the multiple benefits. Here's a couple of examples just quickly. In terms of oil imports, you can see Japan's imports were less than 20% higher than they would have been without the efficiency gains that Japan has made since 2000, and South Africa 13 and Germany 11, etc. Japan and China both reduced their bills for this imported oil by about $20 billion each. So you can see that energy efficiency has tangible benefits for energy security and for bottom lines. It also continued to reduce emissions. So this chart shows how the efficiency gains since 2000 have reduced emissions from the energy sector. Of course, they could be much lower had we hit those 3% improvement rate that we're aiming for. So unfortunately, the green line shows that the gap is starting to widen between where we are and where we could be going with those cost-effective energy efficiency opportunities, and we need something to reverse that trend. One thing that we looked at in this year's report was digitalization, and this offers potentially one interesting way that we can reverse the trend, because while digitalization means that there are more devices using more electricity, depending on what those devices replace, we might see net gains in efficiency and also in demand. And so we spent a little bit of time looking at how this might occur, building on some work from 2017. So first of all, this is just to give you a sense of the context, some growth in digital devices that we saw that could happen based on historical growth rates. This, as I said, could present a risk of higher demand, but also greater opportunities for energy efficiency. And the next slide I just want to use is to demonstrate what I mean by how these devices could help us deliver greater gains in energy efficiency. So traditionally, we've addressed each of the devices in our buildings individually. And this is because a lot of those devices are operated individually. They were sort of siloed from one another. What digitalization does is kind of offers the opportunity to network these devices together, because a lot of these devices now can communicate. They've got network communication devices built into them. And that means that there are new gains that could be new gains possible for energy efficiency. So for a start, by networking them and having the devices communicate, we can find gains in energy efficiency that wouldn't be possible if they were not talking to each other. But more importantly, the gains that these devices can have for the system are sizable. For example, when you connect a home and all of its devices up to the grid, a smart grid, these devices offer a potential source of flexible demand, and that demand can then allow for more variable renewable generation to come onto the grid that generates electricity at different times of the day, depending on the solar or wind resources available. And we can start to coordinate much better across the entire energy system when demand takes place and make sure that it links up to when there is supply. So you can see how that increases the efficiency of the entire energy system. And Tim's going to have a bit more to say about this future prospects for this in his part of the presentation. Finally, on just ending out the efficiency report, we also spent a bit of time this year looking at the policies that will be required if we're to take advantage of those digital devices and the energy efficiency gains that they could bring. And we identified a series of policy principles that the policymakers should be aware of if they are to tap into these sources of potential energy efficiency gain from digitalization. We're going to be spending a bit more time on that this year, so look forward to hopefully producing something online at IEA.org on that. So now I'm going to switch over to the Renewables 2019 report. And unlike the efficiency report, Renewables looks at the current situation, but it also includes forecasts of renewables penetration from the current year to 5 years ahead. And so hopefully we've got some interesting things here that we've taken from that report. And we're really going to focus just on the parts of the report that are relevant to this behind the meter view of the world, meaning what we traditionally call the demand side. Of course, that's changing and a lot more supply is happening on the traditional demand side. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. So first of all, this is the projection over the next 6 years of renewable capacity increases. And we see that renewables are expected to increase their capacity by about 50%, and that equates to 1.2 terawatts of capacity. The largest source of that growth is in PV, which is about 60% of the growth. And that's followed by wind, as you can see there, hydropower and others. Now, 75% of that growth is driven by just 4 markets: China, the EU, India, and the US. But what we want to do now is hone in on this PV number. And what was interesting from this analysis is that nearly 50% of that is coming from distributed PV. So that's why it's relevant for this webinar today, because really where the technology collaboration program is focused on trends behind the meter, and what we're seeing from the renewables perspective is a lot more renewable capacity is going to be coming from buildings and other distributed sources, both on-grid and off-grid, but really small scale is going to take off. The report shows that around 300 gigawatts of distributed PV will be added over the next 6 years, which is about the same amount as onshore wind, as you can see there. Okay, so looking at these numbers in a bit more detail, that growth is really double the previous 5-year period. As you can see, the previous 5-year period from 2013 to 18 was just short of 150 gigawatts. And the distributed PV that we're seeing coming online in the next 5 years is over 300 to 350. So that's quite a big increase in distributed PV. When we look at the breakdown of where that growth is happening, half of it's driven by China, followed by the EU in the light blue and the United States, as well as Japan, India, and Australia. And the growth is really spreading to some of the newer markets as well. Originally, it was concentrated in Europe, and due to some of the strong renewables policies that were incentivizing rooftop PV there. But now that growth is also spreading to China and the US and Japan, amongst others, as well as Latin America and the MENA region. Okay, so looking at now the different sectors where that growth is expected to take place. Essentially, there are 3 segments that the report looks at: off-grid, which is isolated to standalone systems or mini-grids located off the central network. Then there's residential systems for homes that are typically less than about 10 kilowatts in capacity. And then larger commercial-sized systems that are less than 1 megawatt that are used by businesses, industries, and public entities. So if we look at the situation today, more than 2/3 of today's distributed capacity is in the larger commercial segment, led by Europe and followed by China and Asia. And that's what we can see here. But this is going to be, the future now is that commercial systems remain strong, but we also see some strong growth in residential as well. And in the future there, 75% of that growth is going to be in the commercial sector. The reason for this expected growth in the commercial sector is because there's a strong business case in that sector for distributed PV. Economies of scale, which are leading to relatively lower investment costs than the residential sector, make the cost of generating their own electricity more attractive than purchasing it from the grid. And also there's a better match between the supply of sunlight and demand profiles of businesses. So unlike households where people are leaving their homes in the daytime and going to work and not using much energy while their homes are empty, in the commercial sector, you have your businesses, your buildings occupied, and so demand is highest when the sunshine is shining in the middle of the day. So there's a much better alignment of the resource with demand. Okay, going to the next slide. This is just to show that there's one of the exceptions to that is in the US, where residential sector growth is expected to be strongest. And this is for a couple of reasons. First of all, the commercial sector there has faced more challenges. They have lower electricity prices for commercial businesses, mean that it's less compelling than in the residential sector to install solar PV. And there's quite a lot of split incentive issues in the US as well, meaning it's harder for the tenants to install rooftop PV in commercial buildings that they're renting. And finally, finance has been complex in the US, so that we haven't seen the same growth of business models that make it attractive for commercial businesses to install PV. Okay, so going to the next one, this slide shows you that part of the reason for the growth in distributed PV is because increasingly the levelized cost of energy is low and below the retail price in several markets. So here you can see that the retail price in Germany, for example, is up there close to $300 per megawatt hour, and the LCOE in 2018 is hovering between sort of 100 to 150 US dollars per megawatt hour. So there's a very strong incentive in those markets already to be using PV instead of buying your electricity from the grid. And as we see in the future, in other markets, they're expected to catch up. And we can see the LCOE there in 2024 in those markets also at the bottom end, getting below the retail price there. So there's the incentives for installing your own PV are strengthening and making a lot more sense just from a financial point of view, regardless of residential and commercial users' views on things like the environment or climate change. Okay, a couple more slides here just to show, talk about policy now in that space. And what we're seeing here is that there are different ways that governments can incentivize distributed PV. And in the future, we see some change, buy all, sell all models. And that's really where you have two meters set up, one that measures your consumption and then one that measures your production of energy from your PV panels, are expected to drive a lot of the growth in new markets. And partly this is because of lessons learned from net metered incentives and other incentives where governments were facing rather large costs. I think in many markets, they underestimated how popular these incentives would be. And so there's been a policy shift towards buy all, sell all, because really it removes some of the costs for government. And this is being received, differently by different markets, but the way that we did our projections for the next 5 years, we see policies shifting away from some of the traditional incentives because of the fact that the cost of these systems is now so cost effective that governments see less of a need to support them. Okay, and this is just another point on that. Depending on how much PV comes from self-consumption, there is going to be some fairly big implications for both governments and transmission and distribution companies and retailers. So depending on how much self-consumption there is, if it's up to the 75% mark, you can see here that we're reaching around the $60 billion worth of potential revenue losses, and that's losses from selling electrons, but also from that for the government, for example. So this requires new business models essentially, and new tariff models to try and balance the different interests, the interests of the PV owners themselves, as well as the transmission and distribution companies and retailers, as well as the government. Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Tim, who's going to talk about the future and some of the trends that the World Energy Outlook team identified this year.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Okay, so as mentioned today, I'll be introducing some of the work that's recently been published in the World Energy Outlook 2019, released last November. As many of you may know, the World Energy Outlook is an annual publication that uses scenario-based modelling approaches to explore different possible energy futures using a long-term outlook. So in last year's edition, we were projecting out to 2040 for most results and out to 2050 for certain results. So our analysis is undertaken at a country level for many countries and covers all technologies and all fuels. So the principal differences between the three main scenarios that we present in the World Energy Outlook is the energy policy landscape. Firstly, we have our current policy scenario, and this scenario takes into account only policies that are legislated today. So this can essentially be considered as a business as usual scenario. So within this picture, as we can see in this figure, we see global CO2 emissions continuing to increase at around 1% per year. The next scenario is our stated policy scenario. So in this scenario, we include also our view on announced policies and targets, which have not yet become law. So the objective of this scenario is to hold up a mirror to the plans and ambitions announced by policymakers without trying to anticipate how these plans and ambitions might change in the future. And as we can very clearly see here, the stated policy scenario still does not allow us to achieve the emissions reductions that would be compliant with achieving with the Paris Agreement, or allow us to achieve other energy-related sustainable development goals. And it's for this reason that we have a third scenario, which is the sustainable development scenario. So this scenario provides a strategic pathway to meet global climate, air quality, and energy access goals in full. And it's then an important role of the World Energy Outlook to explore how countries can move from a stated policy scenario trajectory through to a sustainable development scenario trajectory. So we analyze the potential role of different technologies and fuels in realizing the required emissions reductions, and we look at the policy toolbox available for policymakers. So as we can see here, energy efficiency will play a key role in achieving these emissions reductions, as well as renewables, both for electricity generation and as a direct source of energy. Likewise, fuel switching, so electrification, carbon capture, and many other technologies. And as this figure illustrates, there is no single or simple solution to achieving this level of emissions reductions. Our country-by-country analysis highlights that each jurisdiction will have a different mix of solutions that will be drawn upon to allow themselves to pass to this sustainable development scenario trajectory. But what I would like to focus on today is the implications of a major increase in the shares of solar PV and wind in electricity generation, and the related potential for consumers of electricity to lower their carbon footprint. So before I jump right into that, let's have a quick look at our projections in the stated policy scenario for how electricity generation and power generation capacity will evolve. So what we can see here, looking again at the stated policy scenario, is that efforts to phase out coal generation in many developed economies, as well as major cost declines for renewable generation technologies and continued policy support and public support for these technologies, means that global coal-fired generation capacity is set to plateau in this scenario. So this is breaking the trend after 100 years of continued growth in coal-fired generation capacity. And if we look at gas continues to see strong growth, both as a substitute for coal-fired generation and also as a complement to variable renewable generation. Nuclear remains relatively flat as retirements of aging nuclear generators in many advanced economies are offset by a doubling of capacity in developing economies such as China. But the real star of the show is renewables, with wind generation capacity set to triple by 2040, and then solar PV set to overtake all other sources of electricity generation capacity by 2035 to become the single largest source globally. And then if we look at the sustainable development scenario, the growth trajectory for both wind and solar would be even stronger, with solar, with renewables totally growing to meet around 2/3 of global electricity demand by 2040 in the sustainable development scenario. So both solar PV and wind each would meet about 20% of global electricity demand in this scenario. And moving forward further to 2050, we would see renewables edging towards 80% of global electricity generation. So now I want to jump into analysing from an end user perspective, what does this incredible growth in generation from solar PV and wind mean for consumers and the emissions related to consumer electricity consumption. So if we take the example of India, We can see that today the relatively low rates of penetration of solar PV and wind mean that the average CO2 intensity across an average day remains relatively constant. So looking at India, coal-fired generation is the backbone of electricity supply. That coal-fired generation is running relatively constantly throughout the day. So this means that the CO2 intensity of electricity supply is relatively constant throughout the day. Now, even in the European Union, where renewables, variable renewables specifically, already meet 16% of generation, we only have a variation of a factor around 1.4 from the hour of minimum CO2 intensity of supply and maximum CO2 intensity of supply. But what's interesting here is with the projected increases in generation from solar PV and from wind, there is going to be a very significant increase in the hourly variability of CO2 intensity. This will then have implications for how we calculate and assess the CO2 intensity or the CO2 emissions linked to our use of electricity. So here, looking at the stated policy scenario, we can see that a huge increase in the role of solar PV in the electricity mix means that during the hours of the day where solar PV generation is concentrated, we have a major or a significant decrease in CO2 intensity because we have all these zero carbon electrons coming into the system. However, during the nighttime periods, we have only a limited decrease in the intensity, CO2 intensity of electricity generation. So this limited decrease is thanks to wind, which is often generating during the evening, but nonetheless, during the evening and especially evening peaks, we're continuing to rely on often carbon-intensive generators to be able to meet electricity demand. So what this means is that in India, we could have a variation of a factor of up to 7 in the average hourly CO2 intensity of electricity supply. So we could have times of the day where the CO2 intensity of electricity is 7 times higher than other hours of the day. And if we look at the European Union, this is also the case where we see solar PV really lowering that CO2 intensity of electricity supply during the middle of the day, while the large shares of wind in the electricity mix in the EU really allow us to bring down that CO2 intensity across the nighttime hours as well. But nonetheless, it does remain harder to bring down the CO2 intensity during the evening peak. And so now if we overlay over these curves, the demand trends that we have today, we can see that electricity demand doesn't necessarily correlate with these hours of low CO2 intensity. Now, obviously, the shape of electricity demand will be changing in the future as we have new uses of electricity emerging, electric vehicles, for example. But what this means is that we're not necessarily benefiting as much as we could from this decrease in the CO2 intensity of electricity generation during certain hours in the day. But there is an important opportunity here because a certain share of electricity demand is flexible. So as mentioned earlier in the presentation by Jeremy, digitalization and the connected nature of many devices and appliances coming onto the market today means that a certain share of electricity demand in any hour can be shifted in time without impacting on the services provided to users. So this purple portion of the graph here is showing us what share of electricity demand throughout every hour in an average day could be shifted in time. And so this means there's a big opportunity to shift some of this demand, shift some of the evening peak, for example, towards the middle of the day and therefore benefit from these lower carbon electrons available in the system at this time. So if we take the example of China, what we've done here is use the World Energy Outlook hourly simulation modeling of economic dispatch of electricity supply and also electricity demand. And we've really analysed what are the gains that we can achieve if we push demand side response, and so if we really tap the flexibility of all end users. And so this enhanced ESR case, which we can see on the right-hand side of the figure, is really looking at if we tap all options. And so this is including things such as behaviour change. And so under behaviour change, we're looking at, okay, if people change their habits in terms of charging electric vehicles, and they start optimizing the charging of these electric vehicles to correspond with the times of lowest CO2 intensity of electricity supply. And so what we can see from this is that by shifting the uses that can be shifted, we can reduce the peak demand in the evenings by around 250 gigawatts here in China in 2040 in the Sustainable Development Scenario, and increase demand during the middle of the day. And increasing demand at this period allows us then to bring in much more solar PV into the system. And so here we're achieving an additional 330 gigawatts of solar PV in 2040. So that's a 20% increase relative to the base Sustainable Development Scenario. And that's without increasing curtailment rates. So we have the same power system with more solar PV coming in just thanks to tapping that additional DSR potential. And in terms of emissions, this means that we're reducing total CO2 emissions by around 16% over the year. So going beyond what we're able to achieve just purely by decarbonising supply without playing on the demand side. And this could also have benefits in terms of electricity bills. So today, many electricity bills or tariff designs simply see a volumetric rate that isn't linked to the time of the day when electricity is consumed. And so that means that there's no incentive to shift electricity uses to different hours of the day to benefit from lower rates. But with tariff designs such as time of use rates or dynamic tariffs, that incentive can then be brought in and passed on to consumers. And what we've seen here in our modelling is that by shifting more of electricity demand to hours of the day when we have low to zero marginal cost variable renewables producing, we can reduce average wholesale electricity prices by around 10%. So there's big potential for savings then on consumer bills if those savings are passed on. So now if we look beyond the potential just to shift demand in time, we can also see this increased variability of CO2 intensity of electricity supply as a major opportunity to further leverage the potential of energy efficiency to reduce emissions. So this big colourful blocky figure is showing us the results of our calculations of how each end use has a different CO2 intensity of electricity generation. So to take a step back, this means that if you're using electricity for a given appliance in the evenings when CO2 intensity of electricity supply is traditionally or is usually higher than it might be in the middle of the day, then over the course of the year, the average emissions associated with this end use will be much higher on a per kilowatt hour basis than an end use that's operating in the middle of the day. So this comes back to what Jeremy was saying earlier when he was explaining distributed solar PV and the attractiveness of solar PV, say, for a commercial building relative to a residential building. So in many cases, commercial buildings and the electricity use within those buildings will have a lower CO2 intensity than in residential buildings, just because commercial buildings are using electricity at times of the day when solar PV is generally feeding into the power system. And so looking right to the right of this figure, we can see that many of the end uses that have the highest CO2 intensity across the year are end uses within the home. So we're looking at home appliances, such as TVs, etc. And so certain appliances that can't actually be shifted in time. And so they're really energy efficiency is the most important lever we have to reduce the emissions associated with those end uses. And we can also look at electric vehicles again. So yes, we can shift when they're charging in time, but we can also make the vehicles more efficient and have gains there. So I think I'll leave it at there in terms of the quick snapshot of this analysis, but we're quite lucky today because we've just published on the website a couple of hours ago a commentary looking specifically at this analysis, so it'll have more detail and more information there. And we can also find more information, obviously, within the World Energy Outlook report.
And those links there that Tim was referring to, the one that's just been published is the one at the bottom.
Yep.
Yeah. And the three reports you can find at the URLs above that. The energy efficiency one is free, so feel free to download that. You may have to register first, but it's free. The other two require a fee. but there's plenty of information up there for free as well, I believe.
Absolutely.
So Hans, we'll hand it back to you now.